Hi, and welcome to Bible 365 with Kathy Carter. Today is day 91. It is March 31st on the calendar. If you are going by, if you've begun on January 1st and you've stuck with me the entire way through, today is March 31st. And we are in the book of Judges. And so this is Judges 1 through 330. And so I just want to give you a little background. Well, first, I want to start with the usual that I am using the 1 year chronological Bible reading plan to do this reading, and we are doing daily readings. They're anywhere from like 2.5 to 4 chapters, sometimes a little more, give or take, usually a 15 to 20-minute reading. And then I follow up with my reading with sort of giving the vibe, the gist of everything that's happening, and then anything that really stood out to me, I share that on the video. And then I'm always looking for your comments to see what you guys thought, how you guys felt about it, if anything stood out to you. So this is we have changed hands again, and we are in the book of Judges. If you have not started at the beginning, if you have not started at Genesis 1, I still welcome you. I love that you're in this. I'm so excited that you are interested enough to possibly start doing this. My encouragement is always to read first before you come in. But I'm going to give a recap because a lot has happened. And again, we're sort of changing hands at this point. So I want to do a really brief discussion of what happened. So if we started back in the book of Genesis, God created the world, and then through a series of people that he chose, there was obviously he created man, and then Adam and Eve, he created Adam and Eve, and then there was the fall, and then they had sons, and then sons and daughters. And then we had Noah, the world was flooded. And then we had Abraham, who sort of was the first one that God chose out of this, I'm going to say, new world. And he wanted Abraham to follow him. So he was then Abraham's God, the Lord, Abraham's God. And this is the one who he wanted, God wanted him to follow him. He made a covenant and a pact with him. And through his sons, this covenant has continued. So the next son was Isaac. The son after that was, Isaac's son was Jacob. And the son after that were the 12 sons of Israel. And then they were taken into slavery, the sons of Israel. And then God saved those sons many, many, many generations later. God saved those sons of Israel out of Egypt, brought them into the land of Canaan, which is the land that he promised to Abraham many, many generations ago. At this point, they are living, these 12 tribes are living in the land of Canaan. And their leader went from being their leader went from being Moses. Moses was their essential king, their leader, and then his brother Aaron was their high priest. God dwelled with them in the tent of meeting, or the tabernacle, and then that was passed on to Joshua and Eleazar. So Eleazar was Aaron's son. Joshua was the person who came after Moses. And then again, they went into Canaan. And then when we left yesterday, so when we finished up the book of Joshua yesterday, Joshua had just died. And so once Joshua dies, now what happens? So Joshua was the last leader, and Eleazar also died. So the high priest died, Aaron's son, the high priest died, and Joshua has died. And so now the Israelite people are left with what? We don't know. We haven't heard yet. So this is how we start the book of Judges. Now, there are a couple of funky things in here that I want to point out. And the first verse is actually one of them. So the first verse, it says, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites? And then the Lord answers, Judah shall go up. I've given the land into their hands. Now, great. This is a fantastic start. Seems like it's exactly where we ended in the book of Joshua. However, we come to chapter 2, and then in chapter 2:6, here's Joshua. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, right? And then we go to verse 8, and it says, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died. And then this sort of chapter, Judges 1 through the beginning of 2, is mostly a repeat of what we've seen in Joshua. So that leaves us in a quandary. What does verse 1 mean? Is this just an understanding that Joshua dies. Chronologically, this doesn't really make sense. And normally I never go to commentary. I just let the Lord kind of speak to me and show, like, sort of light up what it is that he wants me to see for this day, for this recording, for my life, right, for maybe my teachings and any of my Bible studies, like for whatever it is. But I was certainly confused when it came to verse 1. And so I went to commentaries just to see what other people thought or said of it. And I have to tell you, most people just glossed right over it. Most commentators didn't even remark on it. And I was kind of surprised because I feel like it's relatively obvious. So I'm going to leave it at some of my thoughts. And some of my thoughts are that it possibly could be, I want to call it a typo. So it possibly could be that it meant to say after the death of Moses, because chronologically that would make sense. After the death of Moses, Judah is the first people group to go into the land of Canaan and go to war. However, all of the tribes went into Canaan and went to war. So maybe that doesn't necessarily completely make sense. Maybe it's just an understanding that Joshua dies around this period, right? So the author may not have gotten it right at this time. Whatever it may be, it's certainly something to note. If it is a typo or a mistake, then we can say clearly this is a human author, right? And human authors make mistakes. Now, it's something that we can note and we can look at and we can go, okay, what does that mean in the grand scheme of things? Does that mean everything's a lie? Well, certainly not, because it's just, I don't even want to say it's an error in the Bible, because it's not an error necessarily in the story. It's nothing that isn't true. It's just maybe chronologically out of context or out of order. So it's just something to sit with and something to, ponder on. I don't want to look past any of these things, and I don't want to pretend like they're not there and ignore them. It may mean absolutely nothing. And so, but it's just something that when I read it, I was just slightly confused, because as I read it, and I'm going to kind of go over some of the things that happened, we already saw these things happening. So it's a little bit more in depth, though. So what we find out now is Judah asks Simeon, hey, will you come over with me? You come help me out with the Canaanites that are in this land, and then I'll help you out with the Canaanites that are in your land. And so if you guys remember, when Joshua was kind of leading the charge against all of them, what we did notice is there were still some Canaanites stuck in the land, right? So there were some people that wouldn't leave. And so there were Canaanites stuck in the land. And so maybe they got together and they tried to take out those ones that were still stuck in the land. But what it also says is when Joshua, right before Joshua dies, there was peace in the land. So this had to be, again, a little bit before that. Or it could be this is just the way that the tribes came together and went to battle once they got in there. So again, these are just things to think of. So he thought, so they went in and they conquered all of these lands. So the Simeonites came in, worked with the Reubenites, right? Simeonites, worked with the Judites, or the men of Judah. I don't think they ever really called them the Judites, the men of Judah. And they worked together to get most of the Canaans out of their land. Again, there was a little bit of a remnant of the Canaanites in there. And then Reuben went with Simeon, and they went over into Simeon's land, and they were trying to take everyone out in that land. And again, here we see that there are a little bit left in there. And then, so we find out some of the kings' names. And obviously, one of the interesting things to note is in verse 6, I think it's Adonai Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him. He was one of the kings that was in the area. They chased him, caught him, cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And then Adonai Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. So he did this to 70 kings. He said, now God has paid me back for what I did to them. And then they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And so a little bit of payback, right? God gave him a little bit of payback. He had done this to other people, and he recognized that he kind of got this in return. And then I want to go to verse 8. And in verse 8, it says, the men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also and took it. And so they finally took that. If you remember in Joshua, there were still other people living in the land of Jerusalem. So it looks like now they finally got it back. They put the city to sword and set it on fire. And then they went down to fight the Canaanites living in the country, and the Negev and the foothills. And so they started getting all those lands. And then we get another repeat where Caleb says, whoever takes this land, I'm going to give my daughter. And if you guys remember, I actually pointed out the use and the term of brother, and if I was sure if it was really a brother or not a brother. And in this, it says, this is a different thing to use. So this, or a different way he said it. He said, Caleb's younger brother. So Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So I think we just heard brother in the original one. This one, they very specifically and clearly say that it is Caleb's younger brother. So then Othniel would be his nephew. And so a little bit of clarity on that, which I appreciate because sometimes it's not clear the first time. So I appreciate that it's repeated in a few other ways and maybe in slightly different tones. So some things do have get a little bit more clarity. And so anyway, so they take over all of these lands. So I want to move down. This just, again, feels like slightly more detail than we had before. And then most of the lands still have people in it. And so it says almost every tribe, I think, that we hear has. So we go to Zebulun, Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh. So they all still seem to have others in it. And if you remember, again, this is something we talked about before, they become forced laborers. So they become so small, they sort of break them a little bit and they become forced laborers. So, and then in verse 23, I want to note that it says, when they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man coming out of the city. So here we go, a little bit more detail. They saw this guy and they say, show us how to get in the city. And the guy did. And then they protected him and his family. And then he went to the land of the Hittites and he built a city called Luz, which I feel like we've seen in another time, but he built a city and called it Luz. And that's what they have it named. It said to this day, whenever this chronicle was written, this book of Judges, but this chronicle, this story was written. All right. And then verse 34 is the last one I want to read in this chapter. Verse 34 says, the Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down. So it seems like the Danites didn't really take control of their land. And the Amorites were determined also to hold out in Mount Perez, Aijalon, and Shalbim. But when the power of the tribes of Joseph increased, they too were pressed into forced labor. So when Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, got bigger and stronger, which was promised way back when, right? There was a prophecy way back, I believe it was in the book of Genesis, that they were going to be bigger and stronger. And we see that their lands are pretty huge. They helped the Danites and they overtook them and they made the Amorites all forced labor. And so their boundary increased and the others decreased. All right, so now we're going to move on to Judges 2. All right, in Judges 2, the angel of the Lord goes from Gilgal to Bochum, and this is weeping is the word for Bochum. So he's not really necessarily moving. He changes the name to Bochum. And it says, I brought you out of Egypt, led you into the land I swore to give to your ancestors. And he says, I'm not going to break my covenant with you, but you have turned against me. So from this full year of reading, and I've probably mentioned it in a lot of videos, which is why I notice that it's sort of coming to me all the time. What I'm noticing is their biggest sin is the first commandment. And it says, you shall have no other God before me. And it seems like that's their biggest sin, is they continue to turn to other gods. So in my discussion of this, I want to note that, like, even when the one king said, oh, God, punish me for doing this, that, and the other, I believe historically they all believed in some type of God then. It was just which one, right? Which one's going to benefit me the most at this time? If you remember during Exodus, when Moses was up in the mountain, they, like this, immediately, they were barely up there. Moses was barely gone. And they immediately made another God. And not only did they make another God, so they're actually building and making another God, but they said, we're going to say that this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. They had just left the God who brought them out. They saw the cloud of smoke that came down, the cloud of fire that came down, and they were scared not long before that. And so they should have known and recognized that that was their God that they worship, not just to randomly make another God and call him the one, right? So I say that because it was it was common to follow a god then. That is not as common now. So it's not that we're chasing different gods, so to speak, but we're turning away from the one true God. And so I feel like in this day and time, an understanding wouldn't necessarily be that we're going to worship Baal, because everyone would be like, I'm not worshiping Baal. However, we are turning away from the one true God to something else, right? And so anytime we are turning away from the Lord, and this seems to be in all things, that's where our biggest sin lies. Our biggest sin isn't in, I want to say smoking, which isn't a sin. I don't know why I keep using sins that aren't necessarily sins. Our biggest sin isn't lying, cheating, or stealing. And I'm not saying those things are good. I'm not saying those things aren't against the Lord, but those aren't our biggest sins. Our biggest sins are a generalized turning away from the true God, right? And everything that he stands for, everything that he is, which means we need to know who he is and what he stands for, turning away from him and towards anything else, putting anything else above him. And for us these days, it could be our kids, the way we parent, that our kids' momentary happiness can be the most important thing in the world. Oh, well, he doesn't really want to go to church, so I want to let him sleep in today because he had a tough week, right? And I'm just throwing that out, as probably something I've done multiple times, right? It's more important to go on vacation than to take that money and give to someone who needs it. So anytime that we're turning away from what honors God and who God is and turning towards anything else, then we are turning towards another God. And so I want to make that clear. So for those of us who follow the Lord now, we don't go, well, I don't worship any other gods. They worshipped all kinds of other gods back then. I don't worship any other God. Turning away from God is worshiping another God. So I just want to make that as clear as possible. All right. So like I said before, so in verse 6 we got here, so the angel of the Lord went and he said, I brought you out and you guys are breaking my covenant. And then he's yelling at them, why have you done this? And he said, now, he had told them before, I'm not going to drive these people out anymore. They're going to become traps for you. And their gods will be snares to you. And then verse 4, it says, when the angel of the Lord had spoken these things, they all wept aloud. So they were sad, but we don't really see them turning back to God. They did offer sacrifices. So then after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they all went to their own lands. And then in verse 8, Joshua, the son of Nun, died at 110 and they buried him. So again, this is this repeat from the book of Joshua. So then verse 10, we start right away. After that whole generation had been gathered. So now they had lived in the land in a time of peace with Joshua. And then Joshua dies. And then everyone from that generation dies. So it looks like we have maybe a little bit of time after Joshua dies, right? Because if you guys remember, Joshua was from that first generation that was 40 years out in the wilderness. So Joshua and Caleb were by far the oldest people that were living at that time. So Joshua died, and then it seems that whole generation died. So maybe we're talking 20, 30, 40 years, right? We're definitely talking a little bit of a time difference here. Then we say that people moved on. So after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. So that means that generation did not do the things that they were supposed to do. They did not remind them. They did not have all the festivals that they were supposed to be having, because if they did, these people would at least know the Lord. So at some point, they had stopped doing the things that they were supposed to be doing, and they had stopped teaching their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who the Lord was. And so this generation grows up, and they don't really know the truth of who the Lord is. So it says, verse 12, they forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt, and they worshipped various other gods. So he, in his anger, he lets other people come in and start taking over the land and possessing the land. And so I'm going to go to Judges. I think I can get to Judges 3 here. So I'm going to stick with Judges 2:16. The Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these people. So now, as I kind of started with you guys, now there's no longer these leaders as they used to be. So there's no longer a Joshua or a Moses, right? So the king, so to speak, king, leader, overall head honcho kind of guy, that's gone. So now it seems like the nations, the 12 tribes are in some ways fending for themselves, and none of them are following the Lord. And so what God decides to do is they turn away. Once they turn away, they start complaining and grumbling, and they're sad because God has let people overtake them, and they want that to change. And God, because he loves his people, right? These are the people that he chose and saved out of Egypt, and he made a covenant with them. So then he raises up a judge. So a judge, like, which would be now, right? A judge, someone that we're going to see the judge does a little bit more, but he's the one who knows what's right and wrong, and he makes the judgment on the bad people. And so they raise this judge up, and this judge sort of handles the situation, and then the judge lives. Once that judge has died, the land goes into chaos all over again. So we're going to see this cycle, right? So this cycle of people coming in. The judges look like each judge does something a little bit different. So let's get started with the judges. So it says in verse 1, the Lord left nations to test these people, right? So each generation, they left nations to test these people. And what they're testing them for is, are they still going to follow the Lord? And again, we're going to see that they don't. So he left some in the land of Canaan. He did this to teach them warfare, because these people had never been in war. So again, we're going down multiple generations. They'd never been in war, so he's there to teach them warfare. They didn't have any previous battle experience, and so they leave 5 rulers. And in verse 4, they were left to test the Israelites to see whether they would obey the Lord's commands, which he had given their ancestors through Moses. And they didn't. They took daughters in marriage, they gave daughters in marriage, and so they intermarried with all these other people. They did evil, verse 7, in the sights of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God. So they were sold into the hands of this king, Cushan Rishathaim. So they were sold into his hands. And again, they were weeping and crying. They were there for 8 years. Another note so they were there for 8 years under the rule of somebody that was evil and was hostile towards these people. And when I think of that, I think about my generation, and when we're under a leader that we don't like, it can be weeks, months, very rarely years, is it before we hear so much grumbling and so much complaining. And these people had to last. You're going to see 8 years is not that much. It's going to get even bigger than that. So there was 8 years where they were underneath an evil sort of dictator type ruler. And then the Lord lifted up this guy, Othniel. So it's interesting because, again, I was talking about generation of them. There was a generation of these people who didn't know the Lord, but Othniel, we heard who he was. Othniel was the one, unless we're talking about, which it looks like we're not. So Othniel is Caleb's younger brother who saved them. So I don't know how young he was. If you remember, we just heard the story. Caleb's daughter married this guy because he went in against one of the areas and he won. And Caleb said, if you win, you're going to win my daughter's hand. And the daughter asked for like a donkey and springs. And so this guy then was their first judge that they lifted up. So again, he could be significantly older, but this is the first judge that they lifted up. And so this judge came on with a spirit of war. So it says the Spirit of the Lord came on him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. Then the Lord allowed him to overtake this king. So this is the first judge. This judge is somebody that we know connected to Caleb, because Caleb was one of the guys who knew the Lord and loved the Lord and said that the Lord can do anything. And so this guy is connected to him, and he is the first judge that was lifted up, goes in and takes over after 8 years, and he lived for 40 years, because that's how much longer he lived after this was over. So, verse 12, we're getting a second judge. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They did not follow. So the King Eglon from Moab took over. And they had the Ammonites and the Amalekites join them. 18 years. They were good for 40. 18 years, then they had to be overtaken by this king. Again, they cried out to the Lord. And now this is another interesting story where he delivers them Ehud. For some reason, it's important that he's left-handed. So it's a left-handed guy. And he goes into this king, this bad king, to pay tribute. And then he pays tribute. He kind of leaves. When all their people leave, he comes back and he says, hey, let me talk to you, king. And the king says, sure. He's this big fat guy. And he's left-handed. I'm also left-handed. So he takes the sword out of his right thigh, comes up, plunges it into the king, all the way in until the fat covers it. It's pretty gruesome. His bowels spill out. Like, it's very unpleasant. And then they go to war. So once they find out that this king has been overtaken, he goes back and he leads his people into war. And they wind up getting free. And they are free for, he says, in verse 28, it says, follow me. The Lord has given us Moab, your enemy, into your hands. And so they followed him. Verse 30, that day Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years. So obviously this Ehud lived for a long time because he was there for 80 years and the land had peace, remember, while he was alive. So every time a judge comes up, the judge saves Israel, and then there's peace with Israel as long as this person is alive. So this last person was alive for 80 years. And so now they're in peace again, but we're going to see this cycle repeat itself all over again tomorrow when we come back to Judges. So I just want to say, because this is also marked on the calendar, that it is March 31st. Which means it's Easter. And so I want to wish everybody a happy Easter. The Lord has risen on this day, which is good for all of us who believe and follow Jesus. So have a great Easter, and I will see you tomorrow. Keep reading. Like this, subscribe to the channel, and share it with many other people. See you next time, guys.